William Carter had everything a man could ever desire: wealth, power, status. His name commanded respect in every corner of the city, his businesses spanned continents, and his mansion stood like a monument to success. Inside its towering walls, everything spoke of luxury. Marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, silk drapes framed floor-to-ceiling windows, and every corner was adorned with the finest treasures money could buy. Yet despite all of this, William could not find peace. Every night when the world grew quiet, his thoughts grew loud. He would lock his doors twice, then 3 times, pacing through the halls of his mansion, checking security cameras, ensuring that his fortune remained untouched. His vault was filled with gold, yet his heart felt empty. His mind, consumed by fear, played endless scenarios of disaster. What if the market collapsed? What if someone betrayed him? What if his empire crumbled overnight? No amount of wealth could silence the unease that wrapped around him like a shadow. That night, as exhaustion finally pulled him into sleep, his mind carried him into a dream unlike any other. He found himself standing alone in the middle of an endless desert. The sand beneath him shimmered like molten gold, stretching as far as the eye could see. In his hands, he carried a heavy leather bag, its weight unbearable. He looked inside, gold, diamonds, and jewels of immeasurable value. Yet his throat burned with thirst, his skin cracked under the relentless sun, and his legs trembled beneath the weight of his fortune. He walked forward, searching desperately for relief, but there was nothing but gold. The very thing he had spent his life chasing had now become his burden. Then in the distance he saw it, a well standing alone in the vast emptiness. His heart pounded with hope as he stumbled toward it, his hands shaking as he reached for the rope. But just as his fingers grazed the edge, the ground beneath him gave way. He fell, the weight of his fortune pulling him into a bottomless abyss. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. William woke with a start, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. His silk sheets felt suffocating, the walls of his grand bedroom closing in on him. His pulse pounded as he clutched his throat, as if he had truly been suffocating in that endless desert. His heart raced with a fear he could not name. He swung his legs over the bed, his bare feet meeting the cold marble floor as he rose and walked toward his vault. The thick steel door loomed before him, unyielding, a fortress for his wealth. His fingers trembled as he spun the combination lock, and as the door creaked open, his eyes met stacks upon stacks of cash, gold bars, and treasures worth millions. It was all there, safe, untouched. And yet, he still couldn't breathe. He stood, motionless, staring at the fortune he had spent his entire life accumulating, and for the first time he felt its weight. Not the weight of physical gold or currency, but the weight of what it had cost him. The sleepless nights, the constant fear, the walls he had built between himself and the world. He had everything, yet he had nothing. He had spent his life guarding his wealth, yet he had no peace to protect. And in that moment, standing alone in his grand vault, William Carter realized that he was a prisoner, not to thieves or financial ruin, but to his own fear. A fear that no amount of gold could ever silence. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine as William Carter strolled through his private garden. The estate, a sprawling masterpiece of manicured hedges and marble pathways, was his refuge, a place where he could escape, if only for a moment, the weight of his own mind. But even here, surrounded by beauty and silence, peace eluded him. His thoughts were a restless storm, circling the same relentless fears. Then something unexpected: laughter. Not the restrained, calculated laughter of businessmen at a high-stakes meeting, not the polite chuckle of dinner guests at a lavish party. This was something different, light, effortless, free. A sound so rare in William's world that it made him stop in his tracks. He followed the sound and soon found its source: an old monk, seated cross-legged beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient banyan tree. His robes were simple, worn with time, and in his hands he cradled a small porcelain cup, steam rising from its surface. The monk took a sip, sighed contentedly, then chuckled again, as if sharing a private joke with the universe. William frowned. There was nothing remotely amusing about the world he knew. It was a battlefield of contracts, negotiations, and relentless ambition. Yet here was a man with no riches, no possessions, sitting in the dirt, laughing as if he had discovered life's greatest secret. Without thinking, William approached. "Excuse me," he said, his voice firm, demanding an explanation. "Why are you laughing?" The monk looked up, his eyes twinkling with amusement, as if William had asked something profoundly silly. "Why shouldn't I laugh?" he replied. William hesitated. Because you have nothing." The monk raised an eyebrow, then glanced around as if searching for something. "Strange," he mused. "I don't feel like I have nothing." William's frustration flared. He had spent a lifetime accumulating wealth, fortifying himself against misfortune, and yet here was a man who had seemingly abandoned everything, and looked happier for it. It made no sense. "I have everything," William continued, his voice laced with irritation, "and yet I am not happy. How can you, who owns nothing, be so at peace?" The monk smiled, but instead of answering, he lifted a hand and pointed toward a low-hanging branch of the banyan tree. There, perched on the limb, was a small bird. It fluffed its feathers, then burst into song, a clear, bright melody that danced through the air like sunlight on water. William watched in silence. The monk lowered his hand. "Tell me, Mr. Carter," he said softly, "how much money do you think that bird has in its bank account?" William blinked, caught off guard by the absurdity of the question. "None, of course." The monk nodded. "And yet it sings." A strange feeling settled in William's chest, something he could not yet name. The monk continued, his voice calm, steady. "That little bird has no vault, no stocks, no fortune to protect. It does not spend its days worrying about what it will lose. And so it sings, it flies, it is free. Now tell me, Mr. Carter, if a creature with nothing can be so full of joy, why is it that a man with everything cannot find peace?" William had no answer. That night, long after he had returned to his mansion, after he had once again locked his doors and checked his vault, the question followed him. It clung to the edges of his thoughts, whispered in the silence of his grand, empty halls. Why? Why did he, who had spent a lifetime ensuring security, still feel trapped? And why did a simple bird, with no possessions to its name, seem to know a freedom he had never once tasted? Sleep did not come easily. The question haunted William through the night. No matter how he tried to dismiss it, the image of the small bird, singing without a care in the world, clashed violently with the way he lived his life. He tossed and turned in his grand bed, surrounded by luxury, but sleep refused to come. His mind, as always, was restless, filled with calculations, concerns, and the ever-present fear of losing what he had built. By morning, he had made a decision. He would return to the old monk. He needed an answer, something tangible, something logical, something that would make sense in the world he knew. When he arrived at the banyan tree, the monk was exactly where he had been the day before, sipping tea as though he had all the time in the world. The peacefulness on his face both intrigued and irritated William. How could someone live with such ease when life was so uncertain? William sat down, his frustration barely concealed. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he admitted, "but I still don't understand. I have spent my entire life making sure I never have to worry about survival. I have built walls around my fortune, secured my assets, controlled every possible risk. And yet you tell me that a bird who owns nothing lives in peace while I who own everything do not. How is that possible?" The monk said nothing. Instead, he reached for the small clay teapot beside him and lifted a delicate porcelain cup. Slowly he began to pour. The golden liquid streamed steadily from the spout, filling the cup inch by inch. William watched in silence, expecting the monk to stop once the tea reached the rim, but he didn't. The tea continued to flow, spilling over the edge, drenching the monk's hands, splashing onto the ground below. William instinctively leaned forward. "Stop, you're wasting it. The cup is full." The monk set the teapot down and looked at William with a knowing smile. "Ah," he said calmly. "So you do understand." William frowned. "Understand what?" The monk lifted the overflowing cup. "This cup is like your mind, Mr. Carter. It is already full of worries, full of fears, full of calculations and control. You guard your wealth so tightly, plan for every possibility, fear every unknown, and because your cup is so full, there is no space left for anything else. William stared at the tea spilling onto the ground, the weight of the words settling into his chest. The monk continued, his voice gentle but firm. Tell me, if I keep pouring into a cup that is already full, can it receive anything new? William shook his head. The monk nodded. Then how can you expect to find peace when your mind is overflowing with fear? A silence stretched between them, heavy and unshakable. For the first time, William saw himself clearly, not as the powerful man the world believed him to be, but as a man trapped within his own mind. He had spent a lifetime trying to control everything, believing that control would bring him safety. Yet all it had given him was a heart too heavy to rest and a mind too burdened to find peace. The realization was unsettling, almost terrifying. How do I empty the cup? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The monk smiled as though he had been waiting for that very question. Ah, that, he said, pouring himself another cup of tea, this time stopping just before the brim. That is a lesson for another day. And with that, he took a slow, deliberate sip. For the first time in his life, William did not rush for an answer. He simply sat, watching the steam rise, feeling the weight of his own thoughts, and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that it was not his wealth he needed to let go of, it was his fear. The weight of the monk's words clung to William's thoughts like a shadow. The overflowing cup of tea had left him unsettled, forcing him to confront a truth he had spent his entire life avoiding. His mind was too full, too restless, too consumed by control to ever find peace. But understanding the problem was one thing. Letting go of it was another. The next morning, William returned to the banyan tree, his face lined with exhaustion. I know my mind is too full, he admitted, but I don't know how to empty it. The monk studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then let's begin with a simple challenge, he said. Live one day without worrying about money. William frowned. That's impossible. The monk only smiled. Try. And so William tried. At first it seemed simple enough. He told himself he wouldn't think about his investments, wouldn't check the stock market, wouldn't concern himself with the endless calculations that dictated his every decision. He walked through his estate, sat in his garden, watched the sky shift from morning to afternoon, but by midday the silence became unbearable. His fingers twitched with the urge to check his accounts. What if there was a sudden drop in the market? What if one of his competitors made a move while he sat idly by? By evening, the weight of his anxiety was suffocating. He had failed. He was no different than before. That night, as he sat in his study, staring at the untouched documents on his desk, there was a knock at the door. The monk entered, carrying a small oil lamp. Without a word, he placed it on the table between them, and lit the wick. The flame flickered to life, casting a warm glow across the room. William watched in silence. The monk gestured toward the lamp. This flame burns freely, giving light without effort. Then his eyes met William's. Now try to control it. William hesitated. Control it? The monk nodded. Hold it. Keep it in your hand. William frowned, but did as he was told. He reached out, cupping his hands around the flame, trying to grasp it, to contain it. But the moment his fingers closed in, the flame sputtered and died. The room darkened, swallowed by shadows. The monk didn't move. You see, he said softly, the more you try to hold on to the fire, the faster you lose it. He relit the lamp and the flame returned, dancing gently in the still air. Happiness, peace, even life itself, these things are like this flame. They burn freely when left alone, but the moment you try to seize them, they slip away. William sat frozen, staring at the light. Something inside him shifted. He had spent his entire life trying to control everything, his wealth, his future, even his fears. He had gripped his fortune so tightly that it had become a cage, a burden rather than a gift. He had believed that security came from control, but in reality control had only made him more afraid. He reached out again, this time not to hold the flame, but simply to feel its warmth. It flickered, steady and free, needing nothing from him, and, for the first time in his life, William understood. True peace comes not from control but from trust. The lesson of the flame lingered in William's mind, long after the monk had left. He had spent his entire life clutching at wealth, believing that security lay in control. But the more he grasped, the more he suffered. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his grand estate, listening to the silence that had once comforted him, but now felt empty. For the first time, he saw the truth. His wealth had not freed him. It had imprisoned him. The next morning, William did something he had never done before. Instead of checking his financial reports, instead of calculating his next move, he walked outside and sat under the banyan tree where the monk had first shown him the little singing bird. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and simply sat. Still, the world moved around him, the rustling leaves, the distant laughter of children, the scent of damp earth after the night's rain. He had never noticed these things before. He had been too busy, too afraid. That day he made a choice. He would no longer live in fear. At first, the changes were small. He started spending more time with the people around him, the staff in his household, the gardeners who tended to his vast estate, the merchants who came to sell him their finest goods. He asked them about their families, their lives, their struggles, and for the first time he listened. Then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, as he walked through the marketplace, he saw a frail old man sitting by the road, his hands trembling as he tried to count a few small coins. His clothes were tattered, his eyes weary. William watched as the man sighed, realizing he did not have enough to buy even a small meal. In the past, William would have walked by without a second thought. But now something inside him stirred. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and handed the man a gold coin. The old man looked up in shock, his eyes filling with tears. He clasped William's hands and whispered, "May you always have enough." For the rest of the day, William could not stop thinking about that moment. It was such a small act, barely a fraction of his wealth, but the warmth it brought him was unlike anything he had ever felt. He had spent his life accumulating riches, yet nothing he had ever bought had made him feel this light, this free. So he did it again, and again. He began using his fortune to help those in need, not for recognition, not for power, but simply because it felt right. He funded schools for children who had none, built shelters for the homeless, provided food for the hungry. And with every act of giving, something strange began to happen. The fear that had once gripped him, the endless anxiety over losing what he had, began to fade. His mind, once consumed by numbers and profits, felt lighter. He started meditating each morning, finding peace in stillness rather than in control. The nightmares that had haunted him for years slowly disappeared. Then, one morning, as he was getting dressed, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. He stopped. For years he had seen a face hardened by stress, by worry, by the constant weight of protecting his fortune. But the man staring back at him now looked different, softer, lighter, peaceful. It struck him like a revelation. The wealth he had feared losing had never been his real burden. The real burden had been his fear, his clinging, his unwillingness to let go. And now, by giving, by releasing, by choosing to live freely, he had not lost anything. He had gained everything, and for the first time in his life, William Carter smiled, not the measured, practiced smile of a businessman, but a true, effortless smile. The kind that came from knowing that, finally, he was free. A year had passed, and William Carter was no longer the man the world once knew. People still recognized him. His name was still spoken in the corridors of power, his fortune remained vast, and his businesses continued to thrive. But when they looked at him now, they saw something different. The sharp lines of tension that had once marked his face had softened. The restless energy in his eyes, the constant urgency that had driven him for decades, had faded. In its place was something few had ever seen in him before: peace. He no longer spent his nights locked in his study, calculating risks, fearing losses. He no longer woke in cold sweats from nightmares of deserts filled with gold and empty wells. His wealth remained, but it no longer ruled him. Instead, he spent his days walking through the marketplace, not as a distant figure of power, but as a man among people. He stopped to speak with merchants, he played with children, he listened to stories of struggle and offered help where he could. For the first time, he understood what the old monk had tried to teach him. Gyoko kong faila kon hu, malakan it. Wealth is not having more, it is needing less. William had spent a lifetime believing that riches would protect him, that control would bring him security. But the more he had grasped at his fortune, the more it had imprisoned him. True security had never been in his vaults or in his bank accounts. It had been in his ability to let go, in learning that wealth was not a number, but a state of being. As he sat beneath the banyan tree sipping tea, he let the warmth spread through him. The same tree where he had first met the monk, the same place where he had first questioned everything. He thought he knew. He watched the birds flutter from branch to branch, weightless, free, just as they had always been. But now, for the first time, he understood. He smiled to himself. It had taken him a lifetime to learn what the birds had always known. You cannot hold on to peace, you can only allow it. You cannot force happiness, you can only create space for it to exist. For the first time in his life, William Carter knew that he was truly wealthy. Not because of what he owned, but because of what he no longer feared losing. And so I ask you, what does wealth mean to you? Is it measured in bank accounts and possessions, or is it something deeper? True wealth is not found in what we keep, but in what we are willing to release. It is in the ability to wake up each day without fear, to go to sleep each night with a quiet heart. It is in the laughter we share, the kindness we give, the peace we carry within us. So tell me, are you truly wealthy? If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more wisdom and stories that touch the soul, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to A Buddhist Life Philosophy. Because sometimes the richest thing we can do is share what we've learned.